Boker Tov. Today's daf is daf Ches in Shavuos, as we learn for Achenu Kol Beis Yisrael and Asun Basar of Shivya. We're down on about the seventh line, Omar Mar. So again, we're discussing the pasuk, the psukim in Vayikra Hey that talk about if you become tamei and then you do something, you're guilty. You have to bring a carbon olav v'yorei. Now, what did you do? So we suspected, of course, we've determined already that we're talking about it was something involved with Tumas Mikdash V'Kodsha. You became tummy, went into the base of Mikdash while you were tummy, you ate Kodshim. But the Gemara had to say, how do we know? How do we know that that's with this Chiper al Kodesh Mitumas Bnei Yisrael? What is that for? What is it? Chiper al Kodesh Mitumas Bnei Yisrael. We're talking here not about Vayikra Hey, but rather the Parsha of Achrei Mos, this week's Parsha that we're going to we read on Yom Kippur also. What is that for? So we said that kapara is not for carbon olav v'yorei is when you knew about it, you knew you were tamei, you forgot, you went into the base, make sure you ate kodshim. What happens if you knew about it at the beginning, you knew you were tamei, then you forgot, and you went into the base of Mikdash, but you don't remember now that you were tamei. You don't remember. So you can't bring carbon olav v'yorei because you don't remember you did something. You could bring a carbon when you found out that you did something b'shogeg. But I didn't find out. So what happens in that case? So we said the sawyer that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur inside the heichal in the Kodesh Kodashim and in the heichal, that's mechaper. How do we know? Pasuk says v'chiper ala kodesh mitzumos b'nei Yisrael. How do we know that that's what it's speaking about? This is in Vayikra Tezayin, not Vayikra Hey. So that was an Omer Mars. We said yochal ashosh tumas halol yesar mechaper. Maybe it's mechaper for sins that you did inadvertently, the cardinal sins. Agila roya shvichas dam avodah zara. Talmud lomer mitumos from the tumas below called tumas. Not all, even though those things are also called tuma, right? If you mechal Shabbos, that's not called tuma, but the gila roya shvichas damim and avodah zarah are called tuma, but not all tumos, only certain ones. Where do we find that the Torah made a distinction of these tumas from others? But tumas mikdash v'kodshav, because tumas from kodshav we see you bring carbon olav v'yorei. Avkam b'tumas mikdash v'kodshav. Div Rabbi Yehuda. So Rabbi Yehuda says that the carbon that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur inside the heichal, when he sprinkles the dam inside the heichal in the Kodesh Kodashim and on the prochas outside, that is from the chaper. If for people who were tamei when they went into the base of Mikdash or ate kodshim, and then they didn't realize it, they don't remember afterwards that they were tamei when they went in. They forgot they knew they were tamei, then they forgot. They went into the base of Mikdash or ate kodshim, and they never remembered. So for that, this carbon that the carbon gadol brings on Yom Kippur, that suspends it, as we'll see, suspends their punishment for now, until such time as they find out. If they find out later on, oh yeah, I was tamei, then they have to bring the carbon olav v'yorei. My chalak, how is it different? How do we find? In other words, it says because that's mitumos, some of the tumas, not all of them. Where do we find that the tumas of that the tuma is different over here? Right, tumas mikdash v'kodshav is different than other tumas. That the punishment is, let's say, death or kares, or a regular carbon kavua. How? Because here my chalak. How is it different? The ma'isi carbon olav v'yorei. Aim avodah zarah. Wait a minute. Maybe it should be avodah zarah. Maybe the carbon that the Kohen Gadol brings inside on Yom Kippur and the pnimi is really for avodah zarah. Why? Because if you did avodah zarah b'shogeg, right? My chalak. How is it different? The ma'isi seira. Normally, for a regular sin, Mechal Shabbos by mistake, what do you bring? What chatas? A kizbor or a sira, a female lamb or a female goat, right? You bring either one. If you did avodah zarah b'shogeg, you have to bring a sira only, and even if they're more expensive, if you have to bring a regular chatas, you bring kizbor or a sira, so you can take whichever one is cheaper. But if avodah zarah, you have to bring a sira below kizbah. Amrav Kana. So maybe that's what the Chiper Kodesh. Maybe the Kohen Gadol's inside the carbon that he brings inside on Yom Kippur is not machaper for Tumas Mikdash v'Kodshav when he knew it was tamei, forgot about it and went into the base of Mikdash and didn't remember afterwards. Maybe it's for doing a sin of avodah zarah b'shogeg. If he did a sin of avodah zarah b'shogeg, maybe that's what this is for. In other words, he doesn't know. He made a mistake, and he doesn't know that he did avodah zarah b'shogeg. He doesn't remember. He doesn't remember afterwards. He did it b'shogeg, and he doesn't remember that he did a sin. Maybe it's machaber for that. Amar Kana anan cholak lahekel kamina by cholak lahachmer. We're talking about mitumas kol b'nei Yisrael. It's the Korban Yom Kippur is mechaper for some of the things, not all the things. In other words, we said it's Tumas Mekachah, which is a kula. You only bring a korban over yored. It's easier to bring a korban over yored than a korban kavua. Korban kavua, you have to pay for the four-legged animal, no matter what it costs. If you korban over yored, if you're poor, you bring birds. If you're very poor, you bring flour. So that's a kula. This is a chumrah. Avodah zarah is a chumrah. That instead of a kisba or a sir, you have to bring dafka sira, no matter what it costs. So maybe what it's machapa for is a yoledes, a woman who gave birth, who's chayiv to bring a carbon. The cholak is also different. The maisi olav yored. She also brings all that. It's not exactly the same olav yored as we have by shvuas bitui and by shvuas edus and by shvuas and by carbon of tumas mikdash v'kachav. But it's also a kula that if she's not rich, she can bring a poorer carbon, a bird. So Amy Yoledes the chalak the ma'isi olav yored. Amar Voshia l'chol chatasam. We're talking over here. The Kohen Gadol brings the par and the sorry on Yom Kippur for sins, to mechaper for sins that are different. Mitumos, not called tumos. We said different for korban olav yored, which is easier. So that's what you would have to bring if you knew you were. If you found out afterwards you were tummy, you'd have to bring that carbon. But if you don't know. So you bring the Kohen Gadol's carbon on Yom Kippur on the mizbeach on the mizbeach pnimi is suspends it for you. But maybe what it suspends for is for a woman who gave birth.
But how does she not know that she gave birth?
No. But Amy, you'll let us the cholak carbon. Maybe not that she doesn't know she gave birth. Maybe she forgot. Maybe she forgot to bring a carbon. Or it's also possible that she didn't know she gave birth. That's happened too, right? Maybe it's in a case like that. You'll let us, right? So maybe it's for let us. So Rashi says, maybe that's what the carbon of Yom Kippur is for. In other words, it suspends it, at least as we'll see. It doesn't really take away the whole kapara, but it suspends it until such time that she brings her carbon. Let's say she didn't have a chance, as we'll see. She gave birth right before Yom Kippur and didn't get a chance to bring her carbon yet. So it suspends any punishment until that time. Says the Gemara, but the Gemara says different reason. Amar Voshi Achochatasam. The carbon of a Yom Kippur is to atone for sin. Here she's tamei after she gave birth, but she didn't commit a sin. Notice this Rav Shimon Yochai, the Amar Yoledes Nami Chotasi. Shimon Yochai says what that a woman gives birth also is a sinner because she usually swears that she's never going to be with her husband again out of the pain of childbirth, Michael Namer. So there it is a sin. So Reb Shimon goes according to his reason to Amram Komo Mocher. Shimon doesn't learn it out from here. In other words, we learn it out from how do we know that the carbon of Yom Kippur is speaking about Tumas Mikdash V'Kacha, when you were Tameh, you forgot about it, you went to Beis Mikdash, you didn't remember afterwards. So we learn out from the word mitumosam, mitumos b'nei Yisrael v'lo kol tumos. But Reb Shimon, we had an Amid Beis, yes, learns it up in Komo for its very words itself. You can decide it because it says v'chipar la kodesh mitumos. All right, it says dafka mitumos, so it's not learning it out from the fact that from it says mitumos from the tumos, but not all the tumos, but rather v'chipar la kodesh mitumos shel kodesh. We're talking about dafka. We're talking about tumas mikdash v'kacha. We're not talking about other sins like yoledes or avodah zarah or anything like that. So the Mepharshim ask over here, what do you mean we say a woman is a sinner when she gives birth? She has to bring karbanos because she's tamei. Until she brings her carbon, she doesn't have full access to kodshim. But that she sins, he brings down from the Ran. The Ran says, what happens if a woman knows she didn't swear? Most women don't swear, right? Today, most women don't swear they're never going to be with their husbands again out of the pain of childbirth. It's not as difficult today as maybe it was at one time. So if you know you didn't swear, you still have to bring the carbon. So it's not dafka chatas, and this question is not so great, right? Not so kasha. This is a sin that she's a sinner. But if Shimon says if she's a sinner, what are you going to say? She's a sinner. You can't give an answer and say l'chol tu below l'chol tu masam, l'chol tzim below tu masam. Before we said, says for their sins and not for tumah. This says she's only tumah, she's not a sinner. Rav Shimon says she is a sinner. Even according to Rav Shimon, though, even if she knows she didn't sin, she still has to bring the carbon to be matar herself. So you could say that also, that even if you say that she knows she has to bring her carbon, but she still has to bring even though she has to bring carbon, the Yom Kippur is mechaper for, let's say, any sin or suspends any punishment until she brings her carbon. Maybe it's for a Mitzorah who has to bring his karbanos. Maybe that's what it means. Mitzorah is tummy until it brings his karbanos. So maybe it's coming to tell me that the power of the sorrow of Yom Kippur, that you bring the sorrow pnimi, bring on Yom Kippur, suspends punishment until you that. Again, only for chatas, and Mitzorah is not a sinner, he's tamei. And there's a whole idea over here, as it says, v'chiper al kodesh mitumos b'nei Yisrael, right? Mitumos b'nei Yisrael, pishehem l'chol chatosam. So we're talking about their sins. They're tamei, but like we said by the Oleta, she's tamei, but she's not a sinner. Rav Shimon Nachmani the Amar al Shivat Varm the Gam Bam. Shimon Nachmani says, why did a person become mitzora? One of the reasons is for sinning, for lashon hara. So it is for sins. Michael and Amer says Hasam Nogay Dachale over there. Having the tsaras itself, having what we call leprosy, it's not exactly leprosy, but we don't have a better term for it. Having the leprosy itself and the pain of the leprosy is what atones. The carbon lestruye bekal, or some of the gears lestruye bekachim. In other words, bring the carbon to be matter for kachim. Our gear so here is bekal, but on the side he brings down another place to bring down that is for kachim, because the Mitzorah can come into the kahal. It's just he's not usher to come into Yerushalayim. He's usher he has to go out of certain machanos, but he doesn't have. He can come into the walls of Yerushalayim, and therefore, what we're talking about here is that the kapara, where it's like maybe this is a kapara for the Mitzorah, if the Mitzorah is a sinner, the kapara is his very sin, his very sickness, his very leprosy. That's his atonement, and the carbon is simply to matter him to eat kachim. Vayman Nazir Tamei. Nazir Tamei also has to bring carbon. So maybe that's what Yom Kippur is mechaper for. The Sarah Pnimi on Yom Kippur is mechaper for a Nazir who became Tamei has to bring his karbanos. The cholik that's different. Why the Maisi Term B'nei Yoni brings birds. So there it's also different than your standard carbon chatas. Rav Hoshia l'chol chatasam lo tumas. Again, it's for their sins and not for tumah. So all these cases, whether it's the Oledes or the first, what was the first one we brought down? The Yoledes and the Avodah Zarah is really right. The Cholok Achmer, but we said Yoledes and we said the Mitzorah and the Nazir. This is to be matara them, not so to speak, not for their chata. Some of the chalchas and the chotabasa. Well, Blazer Akaper, Damer Nazir Namichote. Blazer Akaper says that a Nazir, even though he puts himself on a higher spiritual level, he's a sinner. God said, enjoy grapes, enjoy wine, and he's abstaining from that. So for that, he's considered a sinner. Michael and Amer. The answer is again, several he'll say no. How do we know that the Sarah of Yom Kippur, the Sarah Pnimi, is brought for Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav and not for some other sin like the cardinal sins or these other sins? He says not because of the pasuk of Pishem L'Chol Chatasam and Mitumos B'nei Yisrael Chasam, but rather because the pasuk says V'Chiper Al Kodesh Mitumos. Right? Tumos Shel Kodesh. That's how he learns it out. That's how we know we're speaking about that. By the way, you see over here, we had before this, we keep quoting Rav Shimon on yesterday's Daf, Rav Shimon Omer Komo Lomad, and here before we said, according to Rav Shimon Bar Yochai, who says what, that Yoledes is also a sinner. What are you going to say? The answer is he goes according to his own reasoning. It says M'kom Menucha. So you see here that Stam Rav Shimon that we had yesterday is really Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. We Gemara really said that. Rashi pointed that out on Beis and Beis pointed out there too. But Stam Rav Shimon of the Gemara is Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Amar Mar. So let's look at that. What Rav Shimon said. Rav Shimon Bar Yochai. Amar Mar. Rav Shimon Omer. How do we know that the power that the Sarah of Yom Kippur, Sarah Pnimi, is speaking about Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav, where you went into Beis Mikdash while you were Tamei? Because it says V'Chiper Al Kodesh Mitumos Shel Kodesh, right? Harayu Omer V'Chiper Al Kodesh Mitumos Shel Kodesh. So we know we're speaking about Tumas Mikdash V'Kachav. Shapar Kam Rav Shimon. So Rav Shimon has a good reasoning. It seems more logical what he says. You know, the very pasuk it says V'Chiper Al Kodesh Mitumos Shel Kodesh. That's what we're speaking about. You don't need to come all these other drushes of mi peshem l'chol chatasam, etc. Mitumos b'nei Israel. V'lo kol tumos, or really drushes mitumos v'lo kol tumos. What's different and what kind of tumah is different? Tumas v'kachav. This is much more explicit according to Reb Shimon. Rabbi Yehuda, why doesn't Rabbi Yehuda agree with Reb Shimon's reasoning? This pasuk of the words right, that he dashes for, that's to tell me that just like he did lefnai lefnim, just like the Kohen sprinkled the dam. Remember 1 and 7 that he does inside the Kodashim, so he has to do in the Heichel also on the parochas or towards the parochas. Reb Shimon, how does Reb Shimon know that? Notice Reb Yehuda says those words are to tell me, right? Rashi says, no Rashi. Just like you did in the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Chipar Kodesh do the same thing over here. The Chipar Kodesh Mitumos is telling me that you got to sprinkle the blood. It's simply telling you whatever you did inside the Kodesh Kodeshim, the Kohen Gadol has to do also on the Heichel towards the Parochas. Reb Shimon, how does Reb Shimon know that? If he uses the drasha of Chipar Kodesh Mitumos to tell me that we're talking about Tumas Mikdash V'Kodshav on Yom Kippur, but mi b'chein yasa, you learn from the word b'chein yasa nafka. Rabbi Yehuda, Rabbi Yisrael, if it wouldn't be from b'chein yasa, having been a nasi par b'sar achrini. Maybe you should bring another par and sar. And after all, the dam of the par and the sar that are brought inside, they're both sprinkled 1 and 7 inside the Kodesh Kodashim, and then also outside the Kodesh Kodashim towards in the Heichel towards the Parochas. So if it would say v'chein yasa, I might think you got to bring another par. You brought a par v'sar on the inner inside the Kodesh Kodashim. Now you got to bring another animal, 2 more animals, a par v'sar, achrina, even navid. Kamash Mula, no, that you don't do that. That's how he knows. But Shimon says v'chein yasa might tell me that. Kamash Mula, you don't do that because that's you learns out from Chipar Kodesh, from the very same blood that you sprinkled in the Kodesh Kodashim. You sprinkle that in the Heichel also. Rab Shimon v'chein yasa l'ol moed minei mashma. V'chein yasa l'ol moed is mashma from the very same blood. So mashmos. How do you understand v'chein yasa? Rabbi Yehuda says v'chein yasa alone might be telling you bring other 2 korbanos, another par and a sar. Shimon says no. V'chein yasa is mashma from the very same korbanos. Either way, Rabbi Yehuda and Rab Shimon both agree that the sar that we bring, the sar Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur inside the Beis Hamikdash, also in the Kodesh Kodashim and the Heichal. That's mechaper for Tumas Mikdash for Kachav. Which Tumas Mikdash for Kachav are we speaking about? Where you knew you were Tameh, you knew you became Tameh, you forgot, you went into the Beis Hamikdash or ate Kachim, and then you didn't remember afterwards. You forgot that you were Tameh. So if you remember you were Tameh afterwards, you'd bring the Karban Olav Yored from Vayikra Perek Chaf. But if you didn't remember, so what happens? Then the sar that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur suspends your punishment. Says the Gemara now, Omar Mar. Now again, we're reviewing, all this is reviewing what we saw yesterday, so, going into detail of yesterday's Gemara.
Wouldn't that be the case for all the chatos that you don't remember?
That's right. That's right. So for that, the sar, that's what the Mishnah said. For that, the sar hamishtalech, the scapegoat, is mekafer for you. For all other sins. For all other sins, the scapegoat. That was we had back in the Mishnah on Daf Beis of Beis. We said that for all other sins that you did, even sins b'mezid that you did tshuva on. So if the other sins, hodav lahoda, then the sar mishtaleach, that's the scapegoat, is mechaper for you, the one they send out, right? The sar mishtaleach mechaper, right? But here we're talking about the Kohen Gadol's carbon that he brings inside the Beis Hamikdash, inside the Heichel, inside the Kodesh Kodashim. What's that mechaper for? It's mechaper for if you knew at the beginning, you forgot, you went into the Beis Hamikdash, and then you didn't remember afterwards. If you remembered afterwards, you bring your own carbon olav yored. But if you remember, that's mechaper for it. Now we're going to analyze that. Omar Mar. So we said on yesterday's stuff. This is all on yesterday's stuff. Yochol, I'll call tumah shebekodesh yesar as a mechaper. Maybe it's mechaper for any tumah. What was we said yesterday? Yochol, I'll call tumah. Ben sheish be'edia, ben shein be'amei. It's mechaper. Anytime you went into the Beis Hamikdash, you said tumah, whether you knew, you didn't know, you forgot, makes no difference. Mechaper. Talmud mi pisheim l'chol chatosam. It's got to be something like a pesha, like mazid, where there is no carbon, right? Where there is no carbon. So, just like where there is no carbon. So over here also, there is no carbon. Where, what are we talking about? What are we trying to exclude? Mind you, yesh b'idiyah v'tchil, yesh b'sof. In other words, if there was a di at the beginning, and if you knew at the beginning, you knew at the end, then you have your own carbon. So high bar carbonu. So we already have a carbon for that. What is it trying to exclude? Right? Right? What is it trying to exclude? He said, "Mi pishim l'chol." What do we say? What does that tell me? That it's got to be map sham she'ena b'nei carbon. Jane pesha. If you do it b'mezid, there's no carbon, right? So afchatom also, then I have a carbon. Excluding this, what are we excluding? If it's yesh b'idiyah b'tchila, the yesh b'idiyah b'sof, it has its own carbon. So, so that's what is that? What are we excluding? Yesh b'idiyah b'tchila, yesh b'idiyah b'sof has a carbon, high bar carbon. So we know. What do I need a pasuk to exclude? Me pishem l'chol. Someone's telling you that the carbon that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur is not machaper for anything that you would have to bring your own carbon for, right? Because it's like pesha, like a mezid. Mezid has no carbon. This also has no carbon. So what are you excluding? If you had your own carbon, what do I need a pasuk for? What do I need this pasuk of exclusion for? You know you have your own carbon for that. Something you have a carbon for. I don't need a pasuk to tell me that you need that you have to bring for that. High bar carbon. In other words, you're trying to exclude saying something that has no carbon, like a mezid. Mezid has no carbon. The same thing we're excluding here that has no carbon. That is something that has no carbon. So what are we excluding? Only something that has no carbon. But if it has a carbon, you would bring it. So Charlie Gemara says, high bar carbon. If you had we're trying to exclude, in other words, the carbon of Yom Kippur is only mechaper for something that doesn't have its own carbon. But this has its so what are we excluding? Yesh b'idiyah v'sof. We already know that it has a carbon. High bar carbon, says Rashi 2 lines from the bottom page. Why do you have to tell me that the sor is not mechaper for that? We already know that. We already know that the yesh yadiyah b'tchil of yesh b'sof, that's the carbon of the yard in Parakeh of Vayikra. So the Gemara says no, it could be lo tzricha. You don't need it. I'll tell you what you need it for. This yadalei samach l'shkiyah sachama. He had a yadiyah. He knew that he was tamei. He went into the Beis Mikdash while he was tamei. But he forgot when he went into the Beis Mikdash. Obviously, he didn't amaze it. And then he didn't remember. That he remembered right before Yom Kippur. Right before Yom Kippur started, at Ne'ilah he remembered, but he didn't have time to bring his own carbon, right? To bring carbon of Sachar. I might think, Adamaisi, till he gets a chance to bring his own carbon of Yored, Nislele. So the carbon of Yom Kippur that the Kohen Gadol brings, the Sor Nasib B'fnim, should suspend any punishment bein tayim, kamashmon, that it doesn't. Why? Because the carbon of Yom Kippur is only mechaper for something that has no yediyah at the end, where you're not going to have your own carbon. You're not going to have your own carbon, right? For example, you didn't remember afterwards, but if you remembered, you bring your own carbon. So of course you have your own carbon. What do I need for that? Let's say you remembered right before Yom Kippur. So you are chayav a carbon of Yored, but you didn't get a chance to bring it yet. Would Yom Kippur be mechaper for you? But or suspend any punishment until you bring your own carbon? Mashma that it doesn't. Yom Kippur is only mechaper for something where there is no carbon. Like you knew at the beginning, you forgot, you went to base, make sure you didn't remember. That's what it's mechaper for. Okay, how says now? Let's understand something again. If you didn't know you were listen.
This carbon he can't bring any time during the year.
But what? Yes, he could.
He could. So what difference does it make that he didn't have time?
Okay, so it'll suspend any. We'll see, because it'll.
So you can bring it.
That's right. That's right. That's right. But it'll suspend any suffering that he may suffer in between. The Gemara is going to say that it'll suspend any punishment or any suffering that he would have for not bringing until he brings the carbon. You could always say that. You could bring a carbon. I say I sinned. I made a mistake. I Machal Shabbos, and I'll bring it when I'm 90 years old, 100 years old. I'll bring it later on. Yeah, but what's the point of bringing it right away? To get a kapara right away, so you won't be punished, or you won't suffer at all for your sins. So you want to bring. So that's the question. Question is, yes, I'll bring my own carbon of Yored and chalamoy. But what about, will I get punished in between? Maybe I'll suffer in between for that? Would the carbon of Yom Kippur suspend any punishment or any suffering? The answer is it won't in that case. What are we saying now? That it only suspends punishment if you knew about it at the beginning, you forgot, and then you didn't remember afterwards. So you're not ready to bring a carbon yet. You don't remember. You may never remember, but you could remember later on. Now let's look at it. Let's say you never knew you were tamei. You never knew. You didn't know at the beginning. You went in basement. You never knew you were tamei. Your whole life, you never knew you were tamei. So what takes care of that? So we said the serum of Rosh Chodesh and the regalim, the carbon musaf, that's really the carbon musaf that you bring in, is mechaper for that. Okay? You didn't know anything. Okay? let's say you knew at the beginning and you knew at the end, you forgot in between. That's the carbon of the Yored of Vayikra, right? So that's the second possibility. The other possibility is you didn't know at the beginning. You didn't know at the beginning. You went into the base Mikdash, and then you knew at the end, right? So you don't bring a carbon of the Yored. Carbon of the Yored is only when there's a Yedi at the beginning, Yedi at the end. It says for who Yada, he knew at the beginning, forgot, and you remembered later on. Then he brings a carbon of the Yored. But let's say he didn't know at the beginning. He didn't know at the beginning, like he didn't know that this was a chayla of meat and you ate it. You didn't know, right? But when it comes to Yediyas Atuma, if you didn't know at the beginning, even if you found out later on, you don't bring the carbon of the Yored. For that, what's Machaper? The carbon Musaf of Yom Kippur. That's what the Mishnah said. We're going to talk about that now. So that's the third possibility. One is he didn't know anything. One is he knew at the beginning, knew at the end. One is he didn't know at the beginning, but he knew at the end. And then there's no carbon either. There's no carbon that he brings. The carbon, the Olav Yard is only if he knew at the beginning, he knew at the end. So if he didn't know at the beginning and he went into the base of Mikdash Tameh, even if he found out later on, he doesn't bring carbon Olav Yard. So for that, the carbon Musaf of Yom Kippur is Machaper. What are we talking about here? This whole Gemara is speaking about here. The Chipar LaKodesh, the beginning of Achrei Moshe, we're going to read in Mitzvah tomorrow. What is that speaking about? The carbon of the Sara Nasab Fnim that the Kohen Gadol brings on Yom Kippur, and that's Machaper when he knew at the beginning, forgot, and then he didn't remember afterwards. Now he didn't remember afterwards. Many times you remember things much later on, right? So later on he might be chayav a carbon of the Yoreh, but until such time the Sara of Yom Kippur, Sara Nasab Fnim Yom Kippur suspends any punishment. That's what we said. Now, let's look at it again. Let's look at the top line on Amud Beis now. Amar Mar, now we have all four cases clear, right? Amar Mar, Minayin liyesh b'yitiyah b'tchil ve'en b'sof. How do we know? Right. We said already that maybe it's machaper on everything. No, it can't be, because it's got to be something where it it doesn't have its own carbon. And if he knew at the beginning, knew at the end, and knew at the end, has its own carbon. All right. So isn't it obvious? Yeah. Well, what about a case where he didn't have a chance to bring the carbon before Yom Kippur? You remember right before Yom Kippur, Yom Kippur still doesn't tell of him. Okay. If he knew at the beginning, but he didn't know at the end, Shesar Zetola, that this Sar of Yom Kippur suspends any punishment. Minayin. What kind of a kasha is that? Rashi explains, top line in Rashi, Micah Kashle, Gomer Menayin Shalzeh Mechaper, Hayolafla, we already learned, Dal Sha'ena Bas Carbon Mechaper. You can't bring carbon. In other words, if you knew at the beginning and then you did the Aveira, you went into base Mikdash and you didn't remember at the end that you were Tameh. So you're not bringing a carbon because you didn't remember. So we already know if it's Ein B'Yidi B'Chov, we already said Menayin Shalzeh Mechaper, Hayolaf Dal Sha'ena Bas Carbon Mechaper, because we said, Umid Peshem L'Chol Chatosam, something it's not Mechaper, V'zu Ein Bas Carbon. Right, and this is that you can't bring a carbon, but also so we already know. What isn't it obvious? You said, and it's from the first answer. The question is, isn't it machaper on ultimus? No, only on things that you didn't know about. Okay, so if you didn't know about now at the end, you can't. Only things that there's no carbon for. We said, right? Only thing is it's machaper for things that there's no carbon. But we thought maybe at the beginning, maybe it's machaper on all yediyas. No. Carbon chain special amazing. After Tom Shem carbon. If there's a carbon, if there's the at the beginning, at the end, it has its own carbon, the carbon of the Yoreh. So what is it speaking about? What is the carbon of Yom Kippur for? If there's no carbon for something for which you don't have a carbon. So it's obvious. If you knew at the beginning and didn't know at the end, you're not bringing a carbon. So isn't it, what kind of a kasha is that? Because you already said it's for things that you don't know about, and this you don't know about at the end. Doesn't have its own. You can't bring a carbon because you didn't know. If you didn't know something, you're not going to bring a carbon. So is it obvious? Once you say that we're talking about sins similar to purposeful sins where you don't bring a carbon, you did it amazing. My tell this mapsham de la carbon, just like from you don't bring a carbon for mazid. Afchatom de la carbon, aima, maybe this is what it means. Mapsham de la carbon laolam. When you did some mazid, you never bring a carbon. You never bring a carbon for that. Yes, im chipper be mechaper for you. The coin will be mechaper for you. Some shlech mechaper for you. Death will be mechaper for you. But you don't bring your own carbon if you did it b'mazid. So just like what by Pesha, you don't think only think labnei korban lolam, afchatom labnei korban lolam. Maybe chait also means something you're not going to bring a carbon forever. Here you may bring a carbon. Remember, you understand why? Because you may remember later on. Remember, if you didn't know at the beginning, you never bring a carbon. If you knew at the beginning, you knew at the end, you bring a carbon olaviore. If you didn't know at the beginning and you knew at the end, you also don't bring a carbon. That's what we said the carbon musaf is machaper. But if you knew at the beginning and you didn't know at the end, maybe eventually you will remember at the end, right? It's still open. If you didn't know about it at the beginning, you never knew you were tummy when you committed the sin, you can never bring a carbon for that. There's no carbon olaviore for that. Right? There's like never come. But if you knew at the beginning and then you forgot and you did the sin, you don't remember now, so you don't bring a carbon. That's what Yom Kippur is machap for. But maybe it's not machap for that because there you might remember at the end. Right? It's only things that you'll never bring a carbon for. But over here, just like Dipper Mesa, you're never going to bring a carbon for that. Where you might that for that, in other words, the thing that we said that you bring a carbon musaf for, if there's no yidi at the beginning and there's the at the end, you'll never bring a carbon for that. So maybe that's what Yom Kippur is machaper. If you knew at the beginning, maybe it's sof. Even the chimas yadal. If you find out later on, maybe your friend will tell you, you were tummy yesterday. Maybe bar carbonu. So maybe ema lowless. So maybe Yom Kippur's carbon should not suspend for you. We might say, wait a minute. If that's what you're talking about, that's what Yom Kippur is for. We already learned that that's the carbon musaf. The sar nasr b'chutzah that the Kohen Gadol brings outside on the outer mizbeach, that's the regular carbon musaf from Yom Kippur. On Yom Kippur, you bring a carbon musaf just like on Shabbos and Yontif and Rosh Chodesh, you bring a carbon musaf. So the one where there's no yidi at the beginning and there is a yidi at the end, that we already learned that the Yom Kippur's musaf is mechaper for that. So maybe that's what it should be. So maybe how do you know that the Sawyer Nasr B'fnim is mechaper for Yediyah B'tchila v'lo Yediyah B'sof? No, maybe it's mechaper for lo Yediyah B'tchila v'yesh B'sof, where there's never going to be your own carbon because you didn't know at the beginning. And so he said, yeah, but that's what the Musaf is mechaper for. Salgam, I might think maybe it should be the other way around. Maybe on Yom Kippur's carbon is mechaper, Yom Kippur's inner carbon is mechaper for no yediyah beginning, but yediyah at the end, where you don't have your own carbon, because if you didn't know at the beginning, and the carbon musaf is machaper for the other way around, where you knew at the beginning, you didn't know at the end. Amar Kra, the pasuk says l'chol chatasam, mechal debrei chatos nenu. It says l'chol chatasam tells me that you could be chayav chatas for this. In other words, it's something mechal. It is possible to be chatas. See, when you didn't know at the beginning and you knew at the end, there's never going to be a carbon. Never going to be a carbon. So that we could assign that to the carbon musaf of Yom Kippur. But when we talks about the sword that the Kohen Gadol brings, the Yom Kippur sword that he brings inside, it says l'chol chatas means it has the potential you could bring a chatas. It's a pesha now. It's like a pesha now, but there's no carbon now. But you could bring a chatas. It could be chayav chatas later on when you remember, right? Okay, so therefore, now we know what everything is machaper for. Like this really just confirms what we learned in the Mishnah. What's the reason for it? Again, Yediyah b'tchil yourself. That's Parakeh. If there's no Yediyah at all, then Rosh Chodesh and the Musaf of Rosh Chodesh and Musaf of Yontif is machaper for you. I said that in the Mishnah, right? We'll talk about that more later on. If there's no Yediyah at the beginning and there's Yediyah at the end, that's the musaf of Yom Kippur's mechaper for you because you don't have any carbon for sure. But if you had a yediyah at the beginning, but you didn't remember at the end, so Yom Kippur, the Sar Nasr B'fnim is suspends it for you until such time that you remember that you sinned. Maybe you'll remember in 10 years that you were tummy before you went into the base of Mikdash. Says Gemara ben Eskaper. Why do you say it suspends it? Let it bring a full kapara, right? If you knew at the beginning, you didn't know at the end, and Yom Kippur came along, maybe it makes sure being a kol kapara. So iksiv mechatas. And if it says v'chipra kodesh mitumas meiso mi pesheim l'chol chatasam. If we say mechatasam, you're right. It atones for you from your sin. That means that it has a full atonement. Hashdasiv l'chol chatasam, for your chatas. We're talking about something which will come eventually into a chatas. Meaning, if you're eventually going to be chayv chatas, you can't be mechaper with this. You're going to be mechaper with the sin, with the carbon of your that you're eventually going to bring. If you eventually remember, you knew at the beginning, you didn't know at the end, you eventually may remember. When you remember, you're going to bring your own carbon of yore by Yikra. Hey, So what does the Yom Kippur do? Yom Kippur suspends it. Now it says the Choch the Sam, it's going to come Mechatzos later on. So if it's not Mechaper, what does it have to suspend for? If it doesn't, if Yom Kippur is not Mechaper, because you may remember later on. Again, we're talking not about the carbon Musaf of Yom Kippur, which is Mechaper for no Yidi at the beginning and Yesh Yidi at the end, where you'll never have your own carbon for. Only when you knew at the beginning and you forgot and you don't remember now. Maybe you remember later on. So we say it suspends it until you remember later on. So if it's not mechaper, it's only suspends it. Why does it suspend? Rav Zera, in mace, if a person died in between, mace below, but he dies sinless. Because then if he died in between, at least it's suspended. Rav in mace, Misa, if he died, Misa takes care of it. Misa's mechaper for anything, knocks off anything you did tshuva for, right? If you did tshuva for it, Misa knocks it off, unless it was ben al mechabero. But Rashi says, Misa Marekas, Rashi Divrei Maschil. That's further up. Misa Marekas. If you did tshuva, right? Tshuva doesn't complete the kapara, and Yom Kippur is not mechaper, but Misa is mechaper. Right. It's not for if you die. If you die and you did tshuva, it would take it away. It would take it away anyway, right? Misa is mechaper. You don't need the carbon of Yom Kippur mechaper. What does Yom Kippur do? Yom Kippur suspends any punishment, so that you won't suffer. You won't suffer any punishment in between until such time as you remember to bring it yourself. You don't. If you're dead, it wipes off the kapara, so you'll have a share in the next world. In Olam Haba, for any sins that you did. If you did sins in this world, and let's say a person was Machal Shabbos and he didn't know, right? He didn't know, and he did tshuva for any sins that he might have done, but he doesn't remember that he did that. For that, Misa's mechaper.
What happens if you never made tshuva?
That's if he didn't do tshuva, he got a problem. That's why they try to do. People do vidui and do tshuva before they die. You have to do tshuva, right? Yom Kippur, at least for serious sins. For some sins, Yom Kippur is mechaper also without anything further. But for serious sins, yeah, then you need Misa and Tshuva is mechaper. So we said So we said if there's no, now he didn't know at the beginning that he was tamei, and he found out at the end. But then there's no kapar. He doesn't bring his own carbon. Then the sar and asa b'chutz, which is the carbon musaf, and Yom Kippur together with that is machaper. And that's yomi, the day itself of Yom Kippur together with the carbon musaf is machaper. Michti is we said there's a hekesh between the two karbanos that you bring on Yom Kippur, the sar nas mefnim and the sar nas b'chutz. It says milvad, right? Back in the Mishnah on Beis Manalef, we said. The pasuk is Movad Chatas Akipurim. That it says by on the in the parshas of Pinchas when it talks about all the Korban Musaf, it says you bring the Korban Musaf in Kippur Movad Chatas Akipurim. Why? So there's a hekesh between them. So if the hekesh between them in a chaper pnimi adidei, so let the sor nasa b'fnim mechaper for its own, which we said is what where you knew at the beginning, you didn't know at the end. And on both of them, and the other one also, where you didn't know at the beginning, you knew at the end. Let's say you didn't do a chitzon. Let's say they couldn't find another sor. For some reason, there were no animals available to do the carbon musaf. So let the carbon sor nas b'fnim be mechaper for both. Amar kra achas. The pasuk in Shmo says, Rashi quotes on the whole pasuk. V'chiper aron al karnos of achas bashana. Achas kabar achas mechaper and mechaper shtei kabaros. One carbon can only mechaper for one sin, not for two. Right? It's one kapar that it's mechaper for, not two. So therefore, this is only mechaper. What's the carbon the sor nasa b'fnim mechaper for? Obviously, the sor mishlech is for many sins. But this kapar that we're talking about here, this carbon is only mechaper one sin. One sin would be if you knew at the beginning and you didn't know at the end. But mechaper tzitzin. So when you bring the carbon musaf, let that be mechaper adidei v'ma'id of pnimi. So let the that by the pnimi, by the chitzon l'chor, it doesn't say that. But a chaper chitzon at the day, let the chitzon chaper at the day, which is what? No knowledge at the beginning, and there is knowledge at the end. The amid of pnimi, and what the pnimi did also. Nafkamino l'tumah dir ben zelazeh. Let's say it became tamei between the two karbanos. Let's say in the morning you brought the sar nasma from the kohen gadol, and then later on somebody became tamei, and he didn't know about it at the beginning. Know that it's tamei. So let him chaper. The chaper said the day and or another one that didn't know about it at the end, which is what the carbon of the Pliny is machaper for. The pasuk says achas b'shana. The same pasuk says achas twice. Rashi quotes the whole pasuk near the bottom, trays in the ksivi, about 10 lines from down on the page in Rashi. V'chiper anal karos achas b'shana midam achatas sekipum achas b'shana yechaper. Bereisha the cross samach achas lechaper lechaper karos over the shim lechiper achas she'ein kan el kabarach. Is only one. The sarnas muftim can only mechaper on one sin. At the end. Right, the sefer the cross samach yechaper libashana the chsiv achas bashana yechaper lomer she'ein echad mikol karbanos. No other karbanos can be mechaper on this, only this. In other words, the pasuk it says it can only mechaper on one thing. That's the pasuk referring to the pnimi, to the kohen gadol's pnimi carbon. The carbon, and later on at the end of the pasuk when it says achas bashana, is telling you that no other carbon, including the carbon musav, can be mechaper on this particular sin, the sin of Tumas Kachav, where you knew at the beginning and you didn't know at the end. In other words, the kapara for knowing at the beginning and not knowing at the end, which is really a tola, not carbon, can only happen once a year. So yes, there are karbanos or mechaper like the sar mishlechas, mechaper for many things, but the sar nasr b'fnim is only mechaper for one thing, yediyah b'tchila v'ein yediyah b'sof, and the other pasuk, why not? Maybe the carbon musaf should be mechaper for both things. It says no. The kapara or the tliya that it suspends it can only happen once. Can't happen by any other carbon. Only once, only by the pnimi, not by the chitza. No other carbon can be mechaper for that sin of yidi b'tchil b'sof. Now we said that that ein by yidi b'tchila v'yesh yidi b'sof, right? So what happens in that case? What's mechaper for that? Yesh yidi b'sof. That's the musaf, the carbon musaf for Yom Kippur is mechaper for that, right? Because you're never gonna have a carbon there. So the Gemara later on and Daf Yomi is going to say Rishmol Damer Ein Ba Yidi B'Tchila V'Yesh Yidi B'Sof. If there's no Yidi at the beginning, but there is a Yidi at the end, bar carbonu, you're bringing the carbon over too. Till now we've said that when do you bring carbon over Yidi at the beginning, Yidi at the end, nothing in between. Rabbi Shmuel holds that if there is a Yidi at the end, you also bring that carbon over Yori. So Sarnas B'Chutz Amayim Mechaper. So what do you need What do you need the carbon musaf on Yom Kippur? The carbon musaf, what is that Mechaper for? We said until now we said the sar of Yom Kippur, the carbon musaf, the sar Nasr B'Chutz on Yom Kippur, which is the carbon musaf, is Mechaper for no Yidi beginning and Yidesh at the end, where you'll never have your own carbon. You'll never have a carbon olive. Rishmal, you do have a carbon olive already there. So what is the musaf Mechaper for? Al She'ein Ba Yidi Lo B'Tchil Lo B'Sof. If you had no Yidi at all, that's what carbon musaf Yom Kippur is for. High sea regal Mesiras Chodesh Mechaper, but we already said the Mishnah that the musaf of the Sholosh Regalim and the musaf of Rosh Chodesh is mechaper for that, where there's no di at all. So like Rav Meir, the answer is Rabbi Shmuel, like Rav Meir, Damer Kol Seirim Kaparas and Shava. All the Seirim, whether it's Yom Kippur, whether all the musaf basically of Yom Kippur, Rosh Hashanah, Sholosh Regalim, Rosh Chodesh, they're all the same. Shaval Tumas Mishra Kachav. So if that's the case, we said that the outer one, the carbon musaf, is compared to the panimi. Why? Because it says milvad chatas hakipurim, right? That's what it says. The carbon musaf. We read the musaf on Yom Kippur. It says milvad chatas hakipurim. Amash is mechaper. What do you mean? It's not mechaper on the same thing. The inner one's only mechaper for knowledge at the beginning, yediyah b'chil v'lo yediyah b'sof, and the outer one's mechaper for everything. The answer is what's in comparison? It means like this. Just like the pnimi is only mechaper on tumas mikvah kachav, specifically yediyah b'tchil lo yediyah b'sof, the outer one is also mechaper only on yediyah satuma, not any other averis. That's what it means. It means, yes, we differentiate between is a mechaper for yediyah b'tchila, yediyah b'sof, or yediyah lo yediyah b'tchila, v'yesh yediyah b'sof, but it's only mechaper for yediyah satuma. All these karbanos are only mechaper for yediyah satuma when you didn't know you were tamei. So all other karbanos, basically all the other musaf, you didn't know at the beginning, you didn't know at the end. On the sar nasr b'fnim, on Yom Kippur is mechaper for yesh yediyah b'tchila v'lo yediyah b'sof. Not really mechaper, suspends it until such time because you may remember later on. So it suspends it from Yisurim. You may not remember for 20 years or 30 years or 50 years, but it suspends it by time. And the sar nasr b'chutz of Yom Kippur, meaning the carbon musaf, according to the Tanakama, that's mechaper for ein yediyah b'tchila v'yesh yediyah b'sof. So you'll never have your own carbon. Rabbi Shmuel says you do bring your own carbon in that. So then the carbon musaf is mechaper for no yediyah at all, like Rav Meir. All right, for tomorrow's Gemara, we'll pick it up from here from the 2 dots. They'll be on the podcast. And on Sunday, Meretz Hashem, we'll pick it up from the first 2 dots on Daf Yud, about 15, 20 lines down. Daf Yud will pick it up from there on Sunday. Shabbat Shalom L'kulam.
Shabbat shalom. Thanks.